Brigham Young University's International Media Studies program of the Department of Communications presents another in a series of panel discussions. Today's topic, Reporting Islam. Hosting today's discussion is Program Director John Hughes, Pulitzer Prize winner and former editor of the Christian Science Monitor.
I'm John Hughes. Welcome to the campus of Brigham Young University. This is another seminar on international communications sponsored by the International Media Studies program of the Department of Communications. Our subject today is Reporting Islam. There are 1 billion Muslims around the world, 4 million of them in the United States, and clearly this is a significant religious and often political force. What we'll be discussing today is how well the media covers this movement. How well do we understand Islam as it is written about and broadcast about? We have assembled three extremely talented and expert panelists to discuss this issue. David Anable is a longtime foreign correspondent and editor for the Christian Science Monitor, been a former managing editor. For the past 7 years, he's been professor of journalism at Boston University, and for most of that time, he's been chair of the department there. He's lectured on many subjects, but his specialty is international terrorism. Dr. John Esposito is director of the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. He's one of the leading U.S. experts on Islam. He's a prolific writer and author, and his latest book is Islam and Democracy. Abdullahi Gallab is a Sudanese journalist who's worked for many Arabic newspapers. In a former Sudanese government, he was Director General of Information, which of course brought him into contact with many visiting Western journalists, and we want to talk to him about that. He's currently an adjunct professor at Brigham Young University, specializing in the area of international communications. David Anable, let me start with you and throw out a general question. The Economist of London Economist, a magazine which I suspect we both respect greatly, said recently that when the West thinks of Islam, it thinks of bombs and bigots. And of course that's not the Economist's viewpoint, that's the Economist expressing what it believes to be a perception. And certainly it is true that whenever a plane seems to blow up across an ocean, a lot of people say maybe that's connected with Islamic extremists. A fair image, how did it develop?
Not a fair image.
Not a fair image.
But probably for many people, a reasonably accurate description of people's knee-jerk reactions. In fact, one example of that, of course, was when the bomb went off in Oklahoma City, and some of the initial responses by Americans was this must be a Muslim, Arab type attack. And in fact, poor
fellow was arrested.
Yes, indeed, somebody was
on the basis of
briefly held. So yes, that tends to be the knee-jerk reaction. Why? I suppose because of a long series of events going back into the 70s and earlier, where Arabs in general and Muslim militants in particular have become associated with terrorist acts of one sort or another, from the Munich Olympic terrorism, the Hezbollah, Hamas, the hijacking, or rather the kidnapping of the American diplomats in Iran, the various acts of hijacking of airplanes, of ships. There has been a long and rather melancholy parade of events which has sunk very deeply, I think, into particularly Americans' consciousness, and rightly or wrongly have become associated in broader terms with Islam. That is a legacy which is going to be very hard for Muslims to overcome. It's something which has sunk in very deeply. And this country tends also to have a media which covers crises and dramas much better than it covers the dynamics of events in general and the underlying context of what goes on. So we as Americans and the public tend to get hit by these dramas and these crises all the time with very little explanation in between as to what's happening, what's the meaning behind it, what's the the real attitudes that exist, what is the truth behind this religion or any other religion. So these dramas and crises tend to be what stay in people's minds.
Let me ask Dr. Esposito. As you can see, Dr. Esposito, David and I are journalists, so we talk about going back to the 70s. But you're an academic, and you go back centuries to look at this.
Referring to my age?
No, your expertise. Okay. This relationship, or even this tension between the West and Islam. Tell us how real it is.
If you frame it in historical perspective, I mean, the irony is that what we really have is a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. And the three traditions worship one God, recognize prophets and revelation, share a lot in common. But historically, despite the points of contact and cooperation, in fact, when Islam came on the scene, that is, when the Islamic community was established and when Islam began to spread, it constituted, from the point of view of the West, a theological and political alternative, and therefore a threat. It was a threat to Christian religious and political hegemony. It was a threat to Christian supersessionism. It was fine for Christians to come along and say, our revelation fulfilled everything in Judaism, you know, we're right, they were partially right, we fulfilled them. But suddenly when Islam came along and extended that logic of supersessionism, that was a threat. And so you have clashes then, you have clashes during the Crusades, you move down to European colonialism, when in fact, as you know, the colonial powers came with their missionaries. And so for both the British and the French, part of the rationale was religio-cultural, you know, missions to civilize. They saw themselves as bringing, if you will, the qualities of Christianity that made the West so strong. If you move into the contemporary period, the establishment of the State of Israel becomes a major form for many Arabs and Muslims of colonialism within the Arab and Muslim world. And so it also feeds the kind of tension. But I think that the way you posed the question was very good, and when you quoted The Economist, the interesting thing about the way The Economist put it, because I think it's true, is he said, when the West thinks about Islam, didn't say when the West thinks about religious extremism or even Muslim extremism. You see? If we're talking about Christianity or Judaism, we never say when the West thinks about Judaism or Christianity and then move to the extremist. We have a different set of filters. We come out of a Judeo-Christian background, most of us. Therefore, when extremists blow up an abortion clinic and call themselves the army of God, when Jewish fanatics kill rabbin or fire on Muslims praying in a mosque, it's not reported as Judaism to begin with, and those of us who hear it don't associate it with mainstream Judaism. If somebody, you don't have anybody getting on TV saying, there go those Jews again, there go those Christians again, those militant Christians, you know, you can count on them, you know. But we would feel free to say that on TV here. So because we have not known a lot about Islam, what happens is the headline events, for which media is headline driven, become the stereotypes by which we don't just look at extremists who manipulate their religious tradition. It becomes the stereotype by which we judge the generality of Muslims and by which we feel free to say this must be Islam.
Abdullahi Gallab, talk for us a little bit about this mistaken perception we have of Islam as a monolithic power. I mean, as I understand it, of the billion Muslims in the world, perhaps 20% are Arabic, are Arabs. And you have these extraordinary diversities. It seems to me Islam must be very different in Indonesia than it is in Afghanistan at the moment, with all the Taliban is doing. Tell us a little bit about this wide array of differences within the Islamic religion.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I would like to add a little bit to what they have done.
Please do.
I think there are three areas that we need to address. The first area is the media. And I think most of the reporters covering Islam are doomed not to be fair. Not because there is a conspiracy, but because there are a lot of things that play together to make them not fair. The other thing is the institutions, the religious institutions. There is a breakthrough now, and there is some kind of understanding in the Western churches, Catholic, Protestant, and in the United States, and they are now trying to come with ideas that why don't we cooperate with Muslims? Why don't we shed away these old stereotypes?
sort of things that he's been talking about going back to the Crusades and before.
Yeah, and the third area, the area of scholarly activity, and these areas, they work together to give the image of Islam, because I think the media is now a little bit back behind. We
They
find
haven't picked up on this.
Was that?
They haven't picked up on this,
Yes.
this moderating.
Yeah,
trend.
because if there is, I think John knows this better, if the Vatican now, or a few years ago, is asking for a dialogue between Muslims and Catholics, and if the Vatican is trying to extend its understanding to what's going in the Islamic world, and to reach some kind of dialogue between Muslims and Christians, the Protestant church and other churches, most of the churches, especially churches in the United States, they are trying to change their attitude toward Muslims, and they are trying to tell their members to change their attitude toward Muslims. And this is a big breakthrough. In the scholarly field also there is a big breakthrough. There is very serious research in this field, and this research does not put all the Muslims together as terrorists, and does not look at them as some kind of a monolithic body. It looks at what's going in the Islamic world in a very fair manner. And I think a live example is John himself. So I think this is very, very important. The journalists, I think the journalists
I was hoping you would get to explain why we're doomed to be unfair and biased.
I think there are three reasons for that. The first reason, and these three reasons, they interplay. The first reason, that this baggage of hatred and animosity in the Western culture since the Crusades or before the Crusades, and this baggage has been ingrained in what we read in education, in Dante, in Shakespeare, all the way. And whenever there is an event, all that history, all that baggage comes roaring. So this is part of the what they have in mind about Islam. The second thing, there is some kind of status inconsistency. So whenever you go to another place, you try to see the negatives of the place and not the positives. The same thing, the other party looks at you. The foreigner is a mystery of the unknown. So most of foreign journalists, when they go there, of course they have some kind of a list, what is to do and what is to cover, and they actually emphasize the negatives. The third thing is what's going on in the world now. Globalization is creating some kind of reflexive kind of modernization in which we entrench ourselves in our old cultures, old embedded ideas or attitudes. And so when you put those together, you will find that they are put up in a setup which they can hardly break out of. And most of journalists, they go like the fire brigade. They go there, cover the story, and come back. So there is those who grow in the job. They try to find a way out of this mold, and some of them succeed to a certain extent. Some of them don't.
I think when you're competing for time, whether you're talking about TV or when people are with networks, you've got all these journalists competing, and therefore the less you even have of foreign coverage, the more you're going to be driven by the headline, the explosive event. And so the constructive things that we're talking about here, the constructive stories, where do they appear? They're done by the religion editor on occasion. Or maybe if there's an important Islamic holiday, we then have what I call the Take a Muslim to Lunch article. You know, Muslims are our neighbor. You know, even though now they're almost as many as American Jews, we talk about them as kind of this exotic, minority. But the real story, for the reporter, the real story is going to be the story that is indeed a threat.
Well, that's true. I mean, the guy's foreign wants 700, 800 words tonight off the top. But don't we, in the journalistic profession, have some kind of responsibility to cover stories that are meaningful but may seem dull, but we have to devise some technique to make them compelling and make them relevant to the reader? Isn't this part of the game?
That's what the game's all about, yes. And I suppose what Abdullahi and John are saying is that we're not succeeding in this, and I think that's probably partly true. But I'd hate to have a blanket condemnation of journalism on these grounds, because I think, in fact, sometimes we do quite a good job. And there are some publications and there are some television programs and so on which, in fact, work very hard not to have this happen. And they do the continuous background cover, not continuous, but occasional backgrounding, which puts things in perspective. It's not just take a Muslim out to lunch coverage. That's a lovely phrase, but I don't think it's entirely fair, John. It's a
But
sort
you'll
of
remember it.
Yes, I will remember it, and I shall now avoid it.
It's what we call a soundbite.
Yes, yes, it's a soundbite. And I suppose journalists are going to love it because it's a soundbite. But I don't think it's quite that bad. And my impression is, in recent years, that in fact journalists, newspapers in general, magazines, and sometimes television too, have gone out of their way to start to introduce Americans, particularly as Muslims become their neighbors, as they increasingly are, with what goes on in the mosque. What is this religion about? Does it believe in cutting people's hands off and in jihad, holy war? 20 years ago, you saw almost none of that. And I think that now you see a lot more of it. And I don't think it's quite fair to say it's always take a Muslim out to lunch.
Notice the way you framed it.
Yeah.
How would you feel if you were a Muslim and somebody came and the leading questions are, do you cut off hands? Do you exercise jihad? I don't walk up to Christians and say,
I wouldn't ask.
do you make bombs? Is it true, as Esposito has said, that the body count of Christians historically is much greater than Muslims? If you let off with that. No, but I mean, at times
I understand the question, John, but you're in fact distorting what I said.
I'm doing what journalists often do to get a good story.
That's not what I said. I was merely saying that they try to correct that false impression which Americans have. And I'm quite sure that most journalists with even an iota of sensitivity would not start a conversation in that way. But I think by putting forward what in fact people do believe and what your neighbor does believe and what he does do in the mosque and what the beliefs of this religion are, you slowly correct an impression which is done by crisis journalism of it is only these other things.
I think the situation has improved in the last few years. I think that, for example, the major newspapers, the LA Times, the New York Times, have done some very good stories on the American Muslim community. I think if one were to look at stories done, for example, initially on the Taliban, you have stories on the Taliban, but then you have other journalists who write broader stories.
Just explain for
the Taliban of Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, you have a shift in power, at least right now, a temporary shift in power, where this group of what are called the Taliban or Islamic students have in fact now have control of, some say, 3/4 of Afghanistan and Kabul, at least
and
for a while.
they'd fairly be called Islamic extremists.
And they've been denounced by Iran as medieval, for example. And I think that...
by Sudan.
And by Sudan.
But may I pick up on that for a moment, because I think that's one of the important points too.
Sudan and Iran being probably the two toughest Islamic countries, right?
That's right.
With Afghanistan now.
With
right?
Afghanistan now.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then I think the point, you talk about...
away from
Sorry,
Go ahead.
you talk about the way in which Iran has now pointed out that Taliban is positively medieval in their attitude towards the Quran and towards Islam. Most of the time, Americans are not hearing Muslims criticizing Muslims, Muslims criticizing Muslim extremists. You do hear Jews criticizing Jewish radicals and extremists. You do hear Christians criticizing Christian radicals and extremists. In fact, you hear it all the time. I think what's perhaps been missing in part in recent years is the predominant Muslims, who I think are clearly people who are of peaceful inclinations, who, as you said at the beginning, believe in many of exactly the same things that Jews and Christians do, have not so much been heard criticizing some of the extremes. Now, I don't know if this is fear. I don't know if it's just that the American process of debate and discussion isn't something which is yet penetrated into Muslim culture so much. I don't know what it is. I think the fact of the matter is there is that vacuum within which these misconceptions can exist.
It's the psychology also. What you have to factor in is the psychology of being and experiencing being an alienated and marginalized minority.
Right.
What a lot of people forget is that for many Muslims in America, it's been keep your head down during the 80s and 90s. I have friends who are MIT PhDs. They walk into their local store, somebody they know, after the Oklahoma bombing, and the person working in the store says to them, "Are you a Muslim fundamentalist?" Or friends who are on a bus who are Arab and who are accosted because people think that they're Iranian. So you've got that mentality. You've got the mentality of not coming from a marginalized minority,
Right.
as I did growing up an Italian American in New York. Italian Americans did not jump out front to be yelling about the reality of the mafia, because we were stereotyped as a people, you know, who were seen as, you know, the majority being the mafia. And so one would get very defensive when one was you know, when you were given a partial reality, but it was presented as the stereotype of your people. When you have that level of insecurity, you react in a different way. American Jews are far more confident as American citizens in this country. They're far more
They used not to be.
institutionalized.
They've gone through
That's
this
true.
stage, right?
That's true.
So maybe this is
It's a stage that communities
an earlier
pass through.
stage.
That's exactly.
So maybe one of the solutions to this is, in fact, for Muslims to work out some ways in which they can have spokesmen, spokespeople,
The issue
who can
is
come
empowerment.
forward and,
Yeah.
in fact, begin to explain and be available to the media to correct these false impressions, which tend to be rather prevalent.
But
I'm
when
glad you said spokespeople, because isn't one of the great image problems of Islam the treatment of women, particularly what's happening in Afghanistan with the way Taliban is treating women? Isn't that
Well, and in Sudan, John,
And
where
this,
we've just had recent reports about the basic separation of men and women there as elsewhere.
sure? Now, isn't that something?
Well, it's something, because Islam and women has always been in the debate, and it's one of the biggest issues. But most of the time, people, they try to look at Islam as a religion which is oppressive to women, which is not true, because
But that's the perception, though.
yeah, that's the perception. Number one, women enjoy a lot of rights, whether at the early days of Islam or within the Islamic, within the Quran. In the early days of Islam, Prophet Muhammad's wife, she was his boss before being his wife. The hadith, most of the hadith, part of the hadith was narrated by his second wife, and he asked people to learn from her. Thirdly, the Quran, when the Quran was put together, it was entrusted to one of his wives, and it was given to her. There are a lot of men around, but it was given to her to have it for some time. So after that, I think after the early days of Islam, and when the Islamic community became bigger, people, they came to Islam with their cultural baggage, and they tried to give that legitimacy by making it Islamic. And that created a lot of problems. And within that problems, hijab was introduced, segregation of women was introduced, harem was introduced. There are a lot of things which were introduced. And those things they stayed there hanging on the heads of Muslims for time, up to now. The other thing, that there are some governments, for a reason or another, they try to impose certain things, and they try to give them this Islamic face, which is not necessarily true. This is their own approach towards women, or their own approach towards Islam. Not necessarily most of the mainstream Muslims agree with them, or other Muslims agree with them. The Sudan government, for example, or the Taliban government, when they try to introduce this strange measures of women, they are trying to do some kind of a political move, and to give it some kind of Islamic face.
It's a quick fix. I mean, I think there are two issues here. Number one, the issue of the government use. Often the government use is a quick fix. It's visible. It's an easy symbol.
Yeah.
You're immediately signaling to everybody, you know, we're introducing something Islamic, we're concerned about the family, and so what you do is you trot this out. But the
You mean
underlying...
they do this for their own populations,
Well, I think
to
so.
make the point that they're
That's right.
legitimate in some way?
That's right. But I think the underlying issue that people miss is that when you talk about women in Muslim society or in Islam, it's not Islam, it's patriarchy. The same thing was true and continues to be true in some areas in Judaism and Christianity.
It's not part of Islamic culture. It's the veil and the scarf and the separation of women is something which is not part of Islamic culture.
Cultural and patriarchal practices become legitimated by religion. This is the way religion functions. All religions function. In every age, religious traditions are used as one goes to define what it means to be religious in an age. One legitimates certain behaviors that are often influenced by local custom and culture in light of the religion. You know, people conclude...
women not allowed to drive cars in Saudi Arabia doesn't come straight from the Quran.
Or modest dress. The Quran says that women should dress modestly. How you judge modesty in Indonesia versus Africa, etc., will have a lot to do with the particular time, the particular place, but also who's doing it. In the past, it's always been men. And so a good deal of the issue here is not so much Islam as it is interpretations of Islam that grew up in a past age that was primarily patriarchal. And so you see Muslims today grappling in their societies with, you know, what is Islamic in terms of practice with regard to women, and what is a vestige of the past that needs to be reinterpreted. But in the short term, you are going to wind up with governments or organizations that when they want this kind of, you know, quick and easy Islamic symbol or legitimacy, they will seize upon this one. It's the easiest one to do very quickly.
There's another thing also, especially in the West, the hijab can be seen as insignia of identity, and there are a lot of ladies.
This is a scarf.
Yeah, the scarf. Yeah, they do it for that reason. In other places, for example, in Iran, the scarf has been some kind of liberator. It allowed wearing the hijab allowed some women to join the workforce and to do some kind of to participate in the society at large. This is, of course, is not. I'm not condoning the hijab because I have my position is very clear in this respect, and I don't think that it is Islamic. I think it's something personal. If you want to do it, just do it. Otherwise, it's up to you. That is my stand in this respect.
Can I suggest, in some ways here, both of you talked about the sort of cultural baggage that we journalists get landed with, and which we take when we go and cover some of these countries overseas. But I think probably the biggest cultural baggage is really more current. It's this sort of thing, which I think catch people's eyes much more than whether they knew about the Crusades in school. But there's another bit of baggage we haven't really talked about at all, and that is that for the last 30, 40 years, one of the big issues which has prompted wars has been the Israeli-Arab conflict. And that has been certainly perceived in many circles as a Jewish-Arab, Jewish-Muslim conflict. And we haven't talked about that. How much does that sort of cultural religious baggage affect the way in which Muslims are perceived in this country?
I don't think there's any doubt about it. When it was suggested to me in the late 1960s that I study Islam, the response that I gave to the chairman of the department at that time, who happened to be an American Jew who was saying I should do this. I was finishing my degree in another area. I said to him, I know, this is right after the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, and I was a New Yorker. I said to him, I know very little about Islam and Arabs, but what I know doesn't make me believe I'd really want to take a look at them. I was influenced by the war, by the coverage of the war, and by Leon Uris's film, which now I realize is just atrocious, but at the time, what did I know? I mean, I went to the movies and I just believed everything that I saw. And so in many ways, that affected me. And what it meant was that for the first 5 years, I spent an enormous amount of time answering colleagues who called me up and said to me, what's wrong with you? I mean, why are you studying that abracadabra stuff? Why are you training yourself for unemployment? Why are you, looking at this kind of peculiar society and peculiar religion? And so much so that many years later, I was asked to write a piece for a magazine called Merino Magazine, which most people wouldn't have seen. It's put out by Religious Order. Yeah. I decided to write the piece because that's the one thing that my mother gets regularly. She gets a lot of religious magazines and journals. The editor of that journal at the time called me up, who was a Merino priest, a Catholic priest, later on became part of the Sandinista government, parenthetically, and he said to me, in your article, you refer to Islam as the second largest of the world's religion. I didn't know that. That so threw him that he then asked me the next question, which sounds absolutely absurd. what's the first largest religion in the world? You know, I'm getting this from a Catholic priest. And I said, Christianity, don't you? But he was so thrown by that other statistic.
Well, doesn't that suggest then we have come quite a long way in the last 20 years?
Yeah.
Well,
But there is a point.
media is not only television and print media, is also film, theater. Have we really made progress in that area?
Well, I think there are two things. One, when you say, haven't we come a long way? I argue that we have. But when you ask why, I would say it's because, in fact, what really has made for much of what we've accomplished in a strange kind of way is the Ayatollah Khomeini. The Iranian Revolution put Islam in the Middle East on the map and made everybody feel that they had to know more about it, and it made publishing books and articles and doing TV programs, etc., you know, important. I spent the first 10 years of my career in an ivory tower. You know, I was like the Maytag man, nobody ever called.
Right.
From the revolution on, one is constantly on the move. The problem we still have, though, with films, and you see it all the time, I mean, these issues have been raised. Disney, for example, has done a number of atrocious things, from Aladdin to a variety of films that are just laden with stereotypes. And when you're getting them out of Disney, but you have, you know, you still have a number of films where this occurs, and until you wind up with a strong lobby. I mean, again, when I was a child in Brooklyn, we had free lunches because we would get a free bus ride down to the FBI to picket when Italians were stereotyped as mafia, etc. And it's only when Muslims really organize and they're seen as having that kind of political and economic clout that one will get a response. Otherwise, you'll get the response that I had from a lawyer with a major network. He called me up about a film that they were doing. And he said, I know that you've written a lot on women in Muslim societies and law. He said, I have a question for you. And I started to answer it. And he said, no. He said, you don't understand. He said, I don't want to know about the subject. What I want to know is, can we be sued? And if we can't, we'll leave it in. I mean, it was interesting. You know, it was like, how wrong is this?
But this is not just the Muslim religion where you get that
You know,
sort of reaction.
yeah, but I
afraid.
mean, it was no, but I think he felt freer because I think if he had stereotyped Catholics in the same way or Jews in the same way, he would have known that there would have been, you know, a constituency that would really rise up in a way in which there's still not that sense that the Muslim community has quite that same clout. I
So
mean,
what you're saying is that basically we need more Abdullahis, more John Espositos, who are available to the media and who are prepared to go and respond vigorously, and who are prepared to also be critical of Muslim militant actions on occasion. Is that fair? Is that what's missing here? I mean,
I think that what is still missing, and it's not that I disagree with anything you've just said, I agree with that. What is still missing is the simple reality of what makes our country tick. What makes our country tick is the bottom line. Mm-hmm. And when Muslims are seen as part of that bottom line, you know, when, for example, I do a briefing at the State Department, as I did a number of years ago, and this was a number of years ago, and the person chairing it says, throughout this conversation, he said, how can we improve our relations with the Middle East, with Arabs, with Islamic fundamentalists, etc. But he said, let's say our Arab-Israeli position is not going to change at all for domestic political reasons, okay? When he says that, there's a problem. But when he then, 2 minutes later, when my colleague says, you do know there are 4 to 6 million Muslims in America, begins to suddenly perk up and say, aha, well, and suddenly starts to move in a slightly different policy direction, because he's beginning to see that reality. And I think the same thing happens with the media or with film people or TV people. If they really feel that there's a constituency out there that if they burn, that constituency will burn them back.
But
I mean that in the best sense, in a nonviolent sense.
Yeah, isn't that
you know,
constituency in the United States, however, the Islamic constituency in the United States, as fragmented and as diverse as Islam at large? I mean, we have tremendous African-American interest and conversion to Islam, but I don't think that particular group is. I mean,
you have tremendous diversity within the Muslim community itself. You have to remember that when you look at at Muslims in America, you've got maybe 30 to 40% African American. But if you look at the rest of the Muslims in America, they come from many different countries of the world in background. I mean, and so you still have a very strong immigrant component that's first generation. But even when you get to second and third generation, you're still talking about a tremendous cultural diversity with those differences that need to be worked through, A. B, you have a community that, given for many who come from overseas, they come from countries where often the government paid and supported a lot of the things that they would now have to pay in support for here. They come from countries where they could not organize and form the kind of lobbies that are so much part of our own society. I mean, America, as you all know, runs on a lobby system.
But
this is very
isn't
foreign
that exactly
and alien.
what they're going to have to do, though, if in fact they're going to get the attention of the media.
Sure.
Because you talked about the bottom line a few moments ago. There was an occasion where, in fact, the Muslim world, or particularly the Arab world, did use the bottom line for some leverage. I remember it as being called the oil embargo.
That's right.
And that backfired in a big way, I would say. Because if anything, in fact, colored negatively the Muslim world at that time, it was the Arab oil embargo. I can remember 1,000 cartoons of Arabs with kafirs lining up their Rolls Royces at gas pumps to get gas at low prices while we were paying high prices. So that was an attempt to use the bottom line, which backfired. Isn't there some danger in that too?
Well, it all depends. I mean, you know, one of the great realities about America is that we can use most of the world's resources, and we can sell products and have people have a real problem getting them overseas, and that's simply done in the name of an open market. When somebody does it back to us, then of course we get upset. I mean, I was upset during the oil embargo. I think, I would say the positive side of the oil embargo was that it did, from the oil embargo to the Iranian Revolution, that put the Middle East on the map. People began to take the area seriously. And so even though there was resentment, there was still some leverage.
Okay, now that brings me to the next point, which again is a problem for the media. How do we cover this sort of thing? How do people get attention when they're being ignored by a big country like this? It tends to be terrorism.
That's right. The message tends to be...
This is how the PLO got its message across. This is how Kenyatta became president of Kenya, after all, was through the Mau Mau, which gave him prominence, got the British out, and then he took over. So how do you then change from being perceived as terrorists, because that's how you've got attention, to now being perceived as peaceful people who have the same sort of ideals at stake as your every other everyday American has? Isn't that the problem we faced because of the Arab-Israel dispute and so on? We've come to a point where the method which was used to get attention is now, in fact, a serious problem.
I think Muslims,
in getting understanding.
Muslims struggle with that, and they are. You now have groups that speak for Muslims, and they're diverse groups. But you have a group like the American Muslim Council, based in Washington, and this group has dealt with the White House, with the State Department. But even as they begin to do it, think of what happens. This group works with Hillary Clinton. After a religious holiday, she brings a group of Muslims from all over the country, professionals, to Washington, and then there's a piece in the Wall Street Journal which attacks Hillary Clinton and says basically she's working with terrorists. Yes. So even when you start to get the beginnings of these groups, it's as if people feel that, gee, if we stick our head up, even if we're mainstream, to the extent that we get visibility, we're somehow seen as a threat. But you are absolutely right. This is the challenge for the American Muslim community in diverse ways to figure out ways of communicating. But the challenge is greater to us. We, the majority, who talk about American liberalism, are challenged to realize, number one, poor syntax, Muslims are us. They are second, third, and fourth generation. Islam is not a foreign religion. There is a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, and Muslims are part and parcel of our society. And once we accept that, then it seems to me the way in which we talk about them, the way in which the media covers that community, in other words, where you cover that community the way you would other mainstream communities, not marginal communities, not curious communities, the way in which we teach about Muslims and Islam in the schools, these things are beginning to change as those of us who are the majority respond. It's not only the minority.
So none of you have yet mentioned Minister Farrakhan and his influence in the United States and what that does to the image of the Islamic movement.
Must be damaging, I would have thought, because particularly if he goes visiting Gaddafi and so on.
But it works both ways. If you look at the community he created, I think you admire his role. But number one, I think Farrakhan, he speaks Islamic with a Christian background. For example, within his last speech, which is major speech, the 1 million man speech, most of the concepts, especially the concept of forgiveness,
atonement.
this is very alien to the Islamic diction. It is basically Christian, and even Muslims, they don't conceive the meaning, don't conceive it that way. The other thing, grazing with those dictators, I don't think that it's a wise thing. And but I can see that he's doing something positive, but at the same time, I think he's damaging that by visiting with Gaddafi and doing these strange things.
I think Farrakhan presents a very interesting study because you have a lot of the problems that we've been raising here. On the one hand, Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam have done some very remarkable things in ghetto areas, and that's been praised by civic leaders, etc. On the other hand, Farrakhan and some of his ministers have made statements that are anti-Semitic, that are militant, etc. But, and here's where we get back to the beginning of our program, if you move beyond Farrakhan's ability to articulate what, for example, many African Americans see as issues, even though many of them may not formally belong to him, move beyond that and say, how many people does he represent? A. What percentage of the Muslim population in the world is that? What percentage of American Muslims? Even more than that, what percentage of African American Muslims? Warith Deen Muhammad, the son of Elijah Muhammad, leads far more African American Muslims. Okay? Yet, who gets all of the media coverage? Who's on the front cover of the New York Times? And in many ways, what Minister Farrakhan represents is what our society is about. If you perform certain actions that are headline events, you go to Libya or Iran, or you get that good, convenient soundbite,
yes.
you are immediately a headline story. And after a while, I mean, one of the things I run into is many Muslims in America will say, why is it that Americans see Islam, and even overseas they say this, simply in terms of Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam? It's a reality.
That brings us back to this question of the quality of reporting, and I thought David was very generous to American correspondents. I'm not sure I agree with you, David. I think the great newspapers you cited, New York Times, Washington Post, sending a fellow to the Middle East, probably send him to Harvard for a year, and he probably does some research. But there are an awful lot of other newspapers, and I think there will be a lot of television stations, because the trend in television is not to cover this kind of story with a network, but someone in a station in Boston or Cincinnati or Atlanta to send a local crew with very little knowledge about the area.
Or even voiceover
or even
report
voiceover
from somebody else.
So, I think those of us in journalism education and universities have some responsibility to do some training of young journalists who think they have an interest in foreign correspondence. But Abdullahi, you have probably met more journalists covering the Middle East than any of us. In your former role in the Sudan, every journalist from every major news organization probably knocked on your door and got to be accredited and so on and so on. What is your appreciation of the quality of preparation that we provide American journalists covering the Middle East? I mean, are they familiar with the history? Are they familiar with the language? Are they familiar with the economics? Are they familiar with the religious background? How do you rate
most of the journalists I met, most of them have no knowledge of the language. They have no knowledge of the history, and they have no knowledge of the conflicts within the area. Sometimes, or most of them, they have different types of briefing. They get briefed from their paper, and most of them, they bring with them some cuttings, and then they go to a station within the city, which is either the American embassy or the British embassy, where they get briefed about the situation, and then they will come to you and they will ask for this or that. Some of them, I found them, they grew on the job. Those who stayed in Cairo or stayed in Nairobi for years. But those who come and visit and go, I don't think that none of them had done something remarkable or something that worthwhile. Those who stayed for some time, they started to understand things and they started to know. I think the whole thing is unfair to the journalists to give somebody such a wide continent like Africa and to place him in Nairobi and to let him work against the odds the difficulty of transportation, the difficulty of having access to these countries, the difficulty of being accredited, and then you ask him to cover the whole country, the whole continent. That is very unfair.
It's unfair, but it's
But it's
almost
fact of
inevitable,
life.
unfortunately,
And it's
because
gonna
of
become
sheer
It's
money.
becoming worse.
Yeah.
And I agree with you,
Yeah.
parachute journalism, the going in and leaving again, is the worst possible form, with the possible exception of voiceovers of somebody else's work. And I don't see the cure of that without a lot more money. And it's only the big organizations that can afford the money or are prepared to do so.
Well, there is a different cure, because if you accept local journalists to participate the way, for example, CNN is now doing in some of its programs, that is a cure.
Yes,
Because
we
there are very competent local journalists and they can contribute. There are some of them now in the New York Times, some of them in CNN, some of them, but they can do something. The other cure, of course, is the alternative media. Now there is Arab media within Europe and within the United States. There's an Arab TV in Washington now. There is an Arab TV, NBC, which is in London. There is newspapers, and they are doing fine. They have their drawbacks, but they are doing fine.
And you have the internet. But I think
Yeah.
the problem you have that for many journalists, in all fairness to them, is that in fact they do move from one area to a new area. They're suddenly dropped in, and that includes even some of the larger newspapers. I've had some people who are going out there who'll ask for a kind of reading list. Can they come by and talk for an hour? And then I'll say, well, when are you going? They'll say, in 3 weeks. And some land on their feet and learn on the job, and others don't, because one of the dangers, and researchers run into this, academic researchers too, when you first go into a new area, who do you wind up grabbing onto? Somebody who looks like you, talks like you, thinks like you, and then when you do the interview, you wind up asking them not only about the politics and socioeconomic situation from their perspective, they wind up telling you about the opposition as well. And I remember a venerable newspaper that you were both associated with, and which I still receive,
Can't imagine.
the Christian Science Monitor, which I absolutely have enjoyed for years. When they had the TV program, you would go in and they'd interview you the day before the story would appear in the newspaper. And I would always have to, they would ask me, what do I think about the reports on North Africa and Tunisia and Algeria? And I would say to them, it's a terrific report to give you the elite idea of what's going on in the society. But what I was also saying is the same elite that's being interviewed about what the government and elites think is also being asked to represent the Islamist, and to characterize the Islamists. And there were no direct interviews with the alternative opposition, etc., because it would take a while before that journalist knew the politics, before that journalist had access. There might be language difficulties, there might be, and I think that gets in the way of for many journalists, of the kind of reporting that you need.
One point, seems to me, is that journalists as a whole have yet to come to grips with the issue of covering complex issues. It doesn't matter if it's the Muslim world or it's any other complex issue. We are not good at covering complexity, and I think our schools are just coming to grips with some of that. We're certainly trying to deal with that issue. The other one, I think, is that there can be help given. And I guess I'm coming around in a circle here, that most journalists are journalists. The way they get their information is by asking people to tell them what's going on. And if we ask people to tell us what's going on, for instance, in the Jewish community or in Israel, there are many excellent sources who will provide us with a huge amount of material at very short notice and will avoid us making too many silly mistakes. I'm sure the same thing applies to many other regions, to many other countries, and so on. I think perhaps a partial cure, at least for this, because stories done at home to back up stories done on the scene can make a big difference, would be in this country to have think tank sources, such again as yourself or others, who are available to educate journalists who may not necessarily be on the scene in Iran or in Kuwait or somewhere, but they nonetheless are doing backup articles, editing assignments and so on in this country, and can provide some context and some balance to what might otherwise be poor coverage.
This is what our center does. I mean, the center was created at Georgetown 3 years ago just to do this. We do it for journalists, we do it for political leaders, you do it for a variety of people. But again, it gets down to how good people are, whether they're journalists or not. And I noticed with the Taliban, for example, a lot of the stories were the same. And then all of a sudden you had a week in review piece in the Sunday Times, where the reporter started with the Taliban, and we did an initial interview, but what she did was spin out and talk about what are the issues raised by the Taliban, how do we see this play across the Muslim world, and then got into the whole question of women, law, but then got into the question of the diversity within, and did a short piece which was able to kind of frame the Taliban story within a broader story, and I think educated that audience.
My feeling is there is a real demand for that if journalists and their editors and producers and basically their owners would grant that there is a demand for that, and not just for trivia.
Exactly.
And my conviction is there is such a demand.
Yeah.
But we have to be sufficiently courageous to cater to it.
That's right.
Rather than doing what seems the obvious, simple, frankly mundane piece, which rehashes all the old generalities.
One thing we do seem to have agreed upon in this program is that there is a tremendous chasm of ignorance, misunderstanding, misperception between the West and Islam. And probably both sides need to, it's in the interest of both sides to do something about that. What is your formula? What should the West do? What should Islam do to try to build bridges, to try to reduce that amount of misperception and understanding that can be reduced?
Well, I'm sort of intrigued. For instance, the Saudis bought UPI, I think with that in mind, although it didn't work out that way. But it does seem to me there can be some investment of oil money into educational processes for the American public. I don't know if you have oil money behind your enterprise or not, but it seems to be one area where some of this money could be well used to improve image and so on. And I think journalists could do a much better job of digging beyond the superficialities.
I think that, again, since it's what we represent, I mean, what the center has been established to do is to address the relationship of Islam and the West, if you will. And I think that what we do and what I think needs to be multiplied, and it's going on, is we address it at every area. We have to hit the curriculum in the schools. We have to do it in terms of massive publications. You know, we've produced the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World, so there's a reference for journalists and others. You write books. But more importantly, we've got to do massive public affairs. That means TV, it means media, it means radio, it means speaking all over the country, all over the world. And I think we are at a new stage. I had lunch with a colleague at the University of Virginia, and we were reflecting how much things have changed in the last 20 years in terms of coverage and awareness of Islam in the Muslim world. Yes, there are a lot of stereotypes out there. Yes, there's a lot of garbage out there, but there's also an awful lot of good stuff that's available for distribution in terms of audio-visual materials, etc. And I think it's just a matter of ratcheting it up. The sad thing is, to get back to the oil, no, as far as I know, we don't have any oil money, but any you can send me is fine. Sad thing is that you don't get the oil money.
American media companies, is that what
No,
you're saying?
no. It was to set up think tanks.
Think tanks, okay.
And educational opportunities.
Okay, because you did make a reference to UPI.
That's something totally separate.
Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha.
I think there are two areas. The area of governmental activities, and I think most of the time governments, they try to channel money the wrong way. They try to get connected with public relation offices so as to promote their image in the Western media. And I think that has been all the time a waste of money and waste of resources. The other area, there are non-governmental organizations now springing all over the place within the United States and outside the United States. And within those, we talked about CARE, there are other institutions which are trying very hard to provide something that can enhance understanding between Muslims and non-Muslims in their area, whether it's Europe or the West or the United States or other places. I think those institutions are very young now, but there is some kind of promise that this kind of activity will produce one day. I think it's a very difficult question because the Islamic world is not a monolithic world, and there is Islamic polity, but there is no Islamic politics. I think there is a number of countries, and each country is trying to do the same thing its own way.
Also, you have enormous poverty.
Yes.
You have, therefore, instability. You have problems of legitimacy. So, in fact, bad times are still going to be there, and stereotypes at times will be fulfilled. And so the challenge is going to be, when that explosive event occurs, not to deny that the explosive event occurred, not to go after the people, that did it. All of that's there, but to be able to frame it within the broader reality so you don't fall back. But regrettably, it's not oil. It's not all oil wealth. And indeed, in the post-Cold War period, with the disappearance of the superpower rivalry in the foreign aid, with the isolationism, the post-Gulf period, with the drying up of oil money being, distributed to other countries, the situation is going to get tough.
Gentlemen, I'm glad that we were able to end on a fairly constructive note. David Anable, John Esposito, Abdullahi Gallab, thank you for helping to educate us. Thanks to our studio audience of students from Brigham Young University. Thanks to the television audience who will be watching this. To the audiences overseas, through the courtesy of the United States Information Agency and Centers for the Study of International Affairs and journalism schools around the country. Thank you for contributing to our education. We appreciate that very much indeed.